You wake up one morning and notice something has changed. The subtle tension that used to linger in conversations has eased, not because the other person has softened, but because you have. The small manipulations, the sideways jabs, the unspoken demands, they no longer have the same power over you. You start making decisions without hesitation, speaking your truth without second-guessing yourself, and setting boundaries that once felt impossible. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, you notice it. A shift in their behavior. The person who once seemed untouchable, always in control, begins to react differently. There's a flicker of confusion in their eyes, a pause in their usual assertiveness, a subtle testing of limits. It's the moment when the dynamic has truly changed, and they realize that the influence they once held over you is gone. It's not dramatic. There's no grand confrontation or sudden declaration. It's in the quiet moments, the way they hesitate before trying to push you, the way they replay old tactics that no longer work, the way they sometimes withdraw or project blame. You can see the internal struggle, even if they never say a word. And in that silence, you feel it too, a sense of freedom, clarity, and calm that comes from knowing you've stepped out of the cycle, reclaimed your power, and finally set yourself above the influence that once controlled your life. When we talk about control in the context of narcissistic behavior, it's important to understand that it isn't just about making decisions or directing others' actions. For a narcissist, control is the foundation of how they relate to the world. It's the way they maintain a sense of power, importance, and security. When someone has been entangled in a relationship with a narcissist, whether it's a romantic partnership, friendship, or professional dynamic, a lot of the interaction revolves around influence. They need to know that their words, actions, and reactions will shape the other person's behavior. When you start reclaiming your autonomy, even in subtle ways, the narcissist notices. This isn't always immediate or conscious on their part. They might first sense it through changes in your behavior. You speak up more, you refuse to engage in arguments that previously gave them leverage, or you stop seeking their approval. These small shifts, though they may feel invisible to you at first, are like alarms going off for the narcissist. They recognize, often instinctively, that the familiar pattern of control is breaking. Narcissists rely heavily on predictability. They expect that the people around them will continue to respond in the same ways they always have, whether that means complying with their demands, reacting to their moods, or feeding their sense of superiority. When you assert boundaries, when you make choices for yourself without checking in for their approval, it disrupts this predictable flow. That disruption, no matter how calm or composed you are while doing it, can feel like a direct challenge to their identity. It's important to note that narcissists often interpret any loss of influence as a personal affront. They equate your independence with a form of failure on their part. This doesn't mean they stop caring about the relationship or the person immediately, but it does mean that internally, a storm is brewing. They may start questioning their own assumptions, wondering why the strategies that always worked before no longer have the same effect. This internal questioning can be uncomfortable and destabilizing for them because their sense of self is tightly linked to how effectively they can maintain control over others. You might also notice behavioral shifts as they respond to this loss of control. Some narcissists attempt to reassert dominance through more obvious tactics, pressuring, criticizing, or testing boundaries to see if they can still elicit the reactions they expect. Others might retreat, acting distant or disengaged, waiting for an opening to regain influence. Both responses, whether aggressive or withdrawn, are rooted in the same core issue: the unsettling realization that they are no longer in charge in the way they once were. For you, this shift in control is significant. It marks the moment when the dynamic of the relationship begins to change. You are no longer operating under their rules or expectations. Instead, you are acting in alignment with your own values, needs, and decisions. This newfound autonomy can feel empowering, but it also requires a level of emotional awareness. The narcissist's reactions may feel intense or confusing, but they are largely a reflection of their struggle with losing control rather than anything inherently wrong with you. Over time, as you continue to stand firm in your independence, the narcissist's sense of control diminishes further. They begin to realize that the familiar patterns they relied upon will not return. This can provoke a range of emotions: frustration, denial, or even attempts to manipulate through guilt or charm. What's crucial in this process is that the power you've reclaimed is not about winning in a traditional sense. It's about re-establishing your own boundaries and sense of self. The narcissist may notice and they may react, but their reaction is a reflection of the shift in the balance, not a measure of your worth or capability. Ultimately, the disruption of control is one of the clearest indicators that change has occurred in the relationship. The narcissist's internal world may feel shaken, even chaotic, because the rules have changed without their consent. They are confronted with the reality that the predictable influence they once wielded is no longer guaranteed. For you, this is a turning point. The moment when autonomy replaces dependency and when the relationship dynamic begins to tilt in a direction that prioritizes your own emotional and psychological well-being. When a narcissist realizes that you have regained your power or independence, the first thing that often comes to the surface is a surge of emotional reactivity. This isn't always obvious from the outside, and it doesn't always come in the form of an explosive outburst. Emotional reactivity is deeply tied to the narcissist's sense of self, which is fragile and highly dependent on external validation. When their sense of control is threatened, they experience emotions that are intense, immediate, and often disproportionate to the situation. You might notice these reactions as sudden anger or irritation over things that previously would not have bothered them. It could be a sharp tone in a casual conversation or an exaggerated response to a minor disagreement. The intensity of these emotions is less about what you've done and more about the internal experience of losing influence. Narcissists are used to being the ones who set the emotional tone, so when that dynamic flips, it can feel destabilizing. Alongside anger, you may also observe confusion or disbelief. Narcissists often operate under the assumption that the people around them will continue to respond predictably. When you assert yourself, maintain boundaries, or refuse to react to manipulative tactics, it challenges their expectations. They may genuinely struggle to understand why their usual strategies are no longer effective. This can manifest as questioning, passive-aggressive comments, or even attempts to rationalize your behavior in ways that preserve their own sense of superiority. Another common emotional reaction is panic or anxiety. Because their sense of self is so entwined with controlling external circumstances, the loss of that control can create a feeling of internal chaos. They may become restless, agitated, or preoccupied, constantly scanning for ways to reassert dominance. This frantic energy often comes across as pressure, guilt-tripping, or subtle attempts to draw you back into old patterns. They are not necessarily thinking about how their behavior affects you. Instead, they are responding to their own inner sense of threat. Shame and embarrassment can also emerge in unexpected ways. Narcissists rely on the perception that they are competent, desirable, or superior. When someone refuses to play the role they expect, it exposes cracks in that carefully maintained image. You may notice them trying to cover up mistakes, downplay their own accountability, or redirect attention in conversations. These reactions are not just defensive, they are a form of emotional self-protection, a way to preserve their identity in the face of a shift they cannot fully control. Sometimes emotional reactivity is expressed through attempts to manipulate or charm. A narcissist may oscillate between anger and charm, trying to regain the upper hand. This can be confusing and disorienting because it mixes intimidation with appeals to your empathy or loyalty. From their perspective, they are testing boundaries, seeing if they can provoke an emotional response that reestablishes the familiar balance of power. Your ability to remain calm and grounded in the face of these swings often frustrates them even more, because it signals that their usual emotional leverage no longer works. It's important to recognize that these reactions are not about you personally. They are about a profound internal disruption for the narcissist. Emotional reactivity is a reflection of the gap between the world as they expect it to be and the reality they are now confronted with. When they see that you have won in some way by setting firm boundaries, prioritizing your needs, or disengaging from manipulative patterns, it challenges their core assumptions and triggers these intense emotions. From your perspective, understanding this emotional reactivity can be empowering. It explains why a person who once seemed so composed or in control suddenly behaves unpredictably. It also reinforces the importance of maintaining your own emotional stability. Narcissists often feed off reactivity, so your calm, grounded response, or even strategic disengagement, can prevent their emotional turbulence from affecting you. Over time, consistent boundaries and emotional steadiness signal that the power dynamic has shifted, and the narcissist's reactive episodes may begin to lose intensity as they realize their previous strategies no longer function. Emotional reactivity, in this sense, becomes a kind of window into the narcissist's inner state. It's a reminder that their outward confidence is often a fragile construct, dependent on the influence they hold over others. Your independence and self-assurance can shake that foundation, eliciting the very emotions that reveal how deeply their sense of control matters to them. Recognizing this pattern allows you to respond with empathy for the underlying fragility, while also protecting your own boundaries and sense of self. One of the most noticeable shifts when a narcissist realizes you've won is how they handle the narrative of your relationship. Narcissists thrive on creating stories that reinforce their superiority and control. For years, they may have employed subtle criticism, gaslighting, or emotional manipulation to maintain an image of themselves as the center of influence. When you reclaim your power, the rules of the story suddenly change. The tactics that once ensured they appeared dominant no longer work, and that can lead to a subtle but significant shift in the way they devalue or attempt to diminish you. Devaluation is central to the narcissist's pattern. They often lower the perceived value of others to maintain a sense of importance and control. When someone asserts boundaries or moves beyond their influence, the narcissist can no longer rely on this automatic mechanism. They may attempt what can be thought of as a devaluation reversal, where they try to rewrite the narrative in their favor. This doesn't always come in obvious attacks. Sometimes it's through backhanded compliments, selective memory, or attempts to make themselves appear generous while subtly minimizing your achievements. At the heart of this reversal is insecurity. Narcissists are deeply threatened by your success, independence, or refusal to engage with their control. The realization that you've won challenges the story they've told themselves and others about your relationship. They may try to reframe events in a way that restores their sense of superiority. For instance, they could claim that any success or growth you've achieved is somehow due to them, or that it isn't as important or meaningful as you perceive it to be. This is less about reality and more about preserving a fragile self-image. You might notice attempts to shift attention back onto them. The narcissist may bring up their own hardships, sacrifices, or past accomplishments in conversations where these details were previously irrelevant. This is a subtle effort to reclaim the upper hand in perception, as if to say, "I am still the one who matters most here." At times, this can come across as confusion or even helplessness, but it is fundamentally a defensive mechanism against the threat your autonomy represents. Another common tactic is indirect comparison. The narcissist may start to compare you to others, suggesting that no one else is as capable, deserving, or reliable. This can feel manipulative, but it's really an attempt to reassert control over the story. They want to define the terms of success and worthiness, and by doing so, they hope to regain the narrative dominance they've lost. The irony is that these attempts often highlight their insecurity more than yours. Gaslighting may also reappear, but in a subtler form. The narcissist might question your perspective or downplay your experiences, trying to convince you that your understanding of events is flawed. This is part of the broader effort to reverse the devaluation process. By undermining your confidence or making you doubt yourself, they hope to restore the dynamic where they remain the authority figure. You may notice this as persistent nitpicking, excessive debate over minor details, or attempts to portray your choices as irrational. It's important to recognize that this process is not about fairness or logic. Narcissists are not engaging with reality as it exists. They are responding to a perceived threat to their identity and control. The devaluation reversal is a coping mechanism. It's how they try to regain equilibrium when the person they once dominated begins to assert independence. From your perspective, it's a sign of progress. You have reached a point where their old tactics are being challenged simply by your presence, your confidence, and your refusal to be diminished. Your response to this dynamic can shape the outcome. Maintaining clarity about your own perspective and reinforcing your boundaries is crucial. When a narcissist tries to reverse the devaluation, it can be tempting to argue or defend yourself, but often the most effective strategy is quiet confidence. Recognizing the narrative manipulation allows you to hold your own story without needing their validation or agreement. This is part of what it means to win. You continue to act in alignment with your truth, regardless of their attempts to rewrite reality. Over time, as the narcissist realizes their efforts to devalue you no longer hold sway, their focus may shift or diminish. They may stop trying to rewrite the story entirely or withdraw from engagement, realizing that the old patterns of superiority and influence are no longer effective. What you observe is not their transformation, but rather the result of your consistent boundary setting and emotional resilience. Their reaction is a reflection of a system of control that has been disrupted, not a measure of your worth or accomplishments. When a narcissist realizes that they no longer have the influence they once held over you, one of the most noticeable shifts in their behavior is either withdrawal or retaliation. These two responses may seem opposite, but they share the same root: a deep discomfort with losing control. Narcissists are used to dictating the rhythm of relationships, shaping interactions to suit their sense of superiority. When that control slips, it can feel like the ground beneath them has shifted, and their reactions reflect a need to regain stability, even if they can't do so directly. Withdrawal can appear almost suddenly. One day, they are present, engaging, and assertive, and the next, they become distant, aloof, or seemingly indifferent. This is not because they have suddenly changed or accepted your independence. Rather, it is a strategy to recalibrate. By pulling back, the narcissist is testing the waters, observing how much influence they have lost, and looking for openings to reassert themselves. It can also be a way to punish you subtly, creating uncertainty or anxiety without engaging directly in conflict. Retaliation, on the other hand, is often more overt. When a narcissist feels that their sense of control is threatened, they may attempt to re-establish dominance through manipulation, criticism, or passive-aggressive behavior. These attempts are rarely proportional to the situation. A minor boundary you set might trigger a disproportionate emotional reaction because for the narcissist, the issue isn't the boundary itself. It's the symbolic message that their control is slipping. Their actions can include undermining your achievements, questioning your choices, or attempting to provoke guilt and compliance. Both withdrawal and retaliation are rooted in anxiety. Narcissists often experience a profound fear when they sense that their previously effective strategies no longer work. Withdrawal is a way of retreating to safety, giving themselves time to assess the situation and regain composure. Retaliation is a way of striking back, attempting to restore a sense of superiority and reaffirm their identity. In either case, their behavior is not about you personally, but rather about the internal struggle of losing a dynamic that has long defined them. This dynamic can be confusing and destabilizing for the person on the receiving end. You may notice a sudden coldness or absence from someone who was once engaged, or you might be confronted with unexpected criticism or manipulation. Understanding that these responses stem from their internal discomfort, not from a reflection of your worth, is crucial. It helps you maintain perspective and resist being pulled back into old patterns of reactivity. Withdrawal can also serve as a subtle test. The narcissist wants to see if you will reach out, apologize, or attempt to re-engage on their terms. They are gauging whether their influence can be restored, even indirectly. Retaliation, meanwhile, often escalates in cycles, especially if they perceive resistance. They may alternate between charm, blame, and criticism in a calculated effort to destabilize your confidence and regain leverage. This pattern is exhausting to witness, but it is predictable once you understand the underlying motivation, control. Another aspect of withdrawal or retaliation is the public versus private display. Narcissists are often acutely aware of how they are perceived by others. Withdrawal may appear calm and measured in public, while in private there may be subtle jabs, manipulation, or emotional pressure. Retaliation might be more performative, designed to make you question your own actions or to influence the perceptions of those around you. The key point is that both responses are defensive strategies, aimed at restoring a narrative in which they remain dominant. It's important to remember that neither withdrawal nor retaliation is permanent if you maintain consistent boundaries. The narcissist's response is proportional to the sense of threat they feel in the moment. When they realize that their attempts to destabilize or manipulate are ineffective, the intensity of these behaviors often diminishes. Your emotional steadiness, clarity, and consistent self-assertion act as a mirror, reflecting back the reality that their old tactics no longer dictate the dynamic. Ultimately, withdrawal or retaliation is a sign that change has occurred. The narcissist is confronted with the fact that you are no longer operating according to their script. Their attempts to regain control are often the clearest evidence that you have shifted the balance in your favor. By recognizing these patterns and responding from a place of calm and awareness, you maintain your autonomy and reinforce the new dynamic. Their reaction is not a measure of failure on your part, but a reflection of the disruption you have created in the cycle of control they once relied upon. When a narcissist realizes you have gained the upper hand, one of the most common reactions you will notice is projection and blame. This is a defense mechanism they use to protect themselves from feelings of inadequacy or guilt. Narcissists often struggle to take responsibility for their actions because doing so would force them to confront vulnerabilities they are uncomfortable acknowledging. Instead, they shift responsibility outward onto you or external circumstances, creating a narrative where they remain blameless. Projection often manifests in subtle ways. They may accuse you of behaving selfishly, manipulative, or unkindly, even when your actions have been entirely reasonable and grounded in setting healthy boundaries. Essentially, they are attributing their own feelings or tendencies to you. This allows them to avoid facing the reality that they may have caused harm or that their attempts at control have failed. It also gives them a sense of control over the narrative, because if you are the one at fault, the story remains centered on them. Blame can also take the form of exaggeration or distortion of events. A narcissist may recount past interactions in a way that makes it seem as though you are responsible for misunderstandings, conflicts, or disappointments. These distortions are not about truth. They are about maintaining the image of themselves as reasonable, competent, and justified. In many cases, they will combine projection and blame with other tactics, like guilt-tripping or subtle criticism, to reinforce their version of reality. One of the challenges in dealing with projection and blame is that it can feel deeply personal. You may start questioning yourself, wondering if you have really caused harm or if your perception of events is flawed. This is exactly what the narcissist counts on. Their projections are designed to create doubt, confusion, or even guilt. Understanding the psychological mechanism behind it allows you to step back emotionally, recognize the tactic for what it is, and resist internalizing the blame. Projection and blame also often coincide with attempts to manipulate perception among others. A narcissist may share their version of events with friends, colleagues, or family, framing themselves as the victim and you as the problem. This serves two purposes. It protects their self-image publicly, and it tests the waters to see if they can sway others into reinforcing their narrative. For someone who has regained their sense of autonomy, this can be disorienting, but remembering that their version of events is filtered through self-preservation rather than reality helps maintain clarity.